400 years before Christ, a 70-year-old man was condemned to death by the democratic Athenian state. Even though his friends urged him to flee, he chose to stay in prison and await his punishment, that of drinking lethal poison. His name was Socrates, and he had fought for Athens as a soldier, and he had also dedicated his life to righteousness, search for truth, and the improvement of his fellow men. Why was he then condemned to death by the people of Athens? Is this an example of an ignorant mob, democracy at its worst? Or did Athens have rational reasons behind killing what would later turn out to be one of the most influential philosophers in the Western tradition? I will here examine if Athens was justified in killing Socrates, looking at how he had indirectly contributed to the temporary removal of democracy and how he was still a potential threat to the existence of democracy in Athens. To understand why Socrates was put to death, it is crucial that we understand the historical context the trial took place in. In the last 30 years before the trial, Athens had been in war with Sparta. Athens surrendered in the year 404 before Christ. At this point, Sparta could have utterly destroyed Athens, but chose instead to remove its defensive walls and fleet and set up an oligarchy government in Athens. Oligarchy simply means rule of a few, and these rulers became known as the 30 tyrants due to their cruel and oppressive government, which involved the killing of many Athenians and confiscation of their property. These 30 tyrants only ruled for a little over a year, when exiled democrats managed to restore democracy in Athens after a period of civil war. Though at the time of Socrates' trial, it was only a few years ago since democracy had been restored, and it was by no means certain that it would continue. The official charges against Socrates was that 1. He had corrupted the youth, and 2. That he worshipped false gods. The first charge, that of corrupting the young people of Athens, was meant to imply that Socrates had been a teacher of young persons who had proven harmful and destructive to the Athenian democratic state. 2 persons who Socrates taught are here important: Alcibiades and Critias. Critias had been the leader of the 30 tyrants and had been killed in the fight against the exiled democrats. Alcibiades had been a prominent Athenian statesman and general during the war between Athens and Sparta, but had betrayed Athens and joined Sparta. He had also been one of the architects behind another oligarchy overthrow of democracy in Athens in 411, which was short-lived, however. Alcibiades was killed before the war ended. We have here then 2 prominent public men who had both contributed to the temporary undoing of the democratic state. Socrates had been the teacher of both, and had also had a very close personal relationship to Alcibiades. Socrates also chose to stay in Athens during the rule of the 30 tyrants, even though he could have left the city, thus implicating him with the rule. But even though he stayed in Athens, he did somewhat distance himself from the 30, since at the risk of his own life he refused to carry out orders from the 30 that would lead to the execution of a just man. Socrates' teaching was critical of democracy. He illustrated his problems with democracy by an analogy with a ship. On board, everyone tries to get control of the ship, but this does not mean that the most competent person in steering that ship will actually get to steer. It is the one who's best at getting control of it, be it due to intrigue or physical might, that will actually get to steer and influence the ship. But what is needed in the steering of a ship is someone who knows the tides, can plot a course, and so on. And the fight for control does not mean that the one who wins actually got skills in controlling the ship. Likewise, in a democratic state, the ones who get to rule may simply be best at influencing the people and attaining a prominent position, but may not actually know about ruling. The second charge, that of worshipping false gods, covers the fact that it is likely that Socrates was an atheist and possibly only superficially performed the required ceremonies to the gods. He claimed several times that he had an own personal voice that spoke to him, influencing his decisions, a kind of own private god. Now the Greeks had another conception of the difference between private and public, and the charge of impiety is more or less an assessment whether or not the man is good or bad for the city. In Athens, it was believed that individuals could harm the city by not respecting the gods, since the thriving of Athens depended in large part of the favor of the gods. One man, by being impious, could damage this relationship. But it is likely that if this was Socrates' only crime, nothing would have happened to him. It was simply a sort of cover for a political motive, and that was the fact that he had been indirectly involved in the undoing of democracy. What supports this point of view is that in later trials of impiety of two philosophers, for both of them the real reason for the trial was political. For example, one of them was in favor of Macedonian rule of Athens. At the trial itself, which like all trials only lasted one day, Socrates could have suggested exile as his punishment, and it is likely that this would be accepted. Instead, he insisted he had done nothing wrong, and that he had helped trying to improve the state, and that he should therefore be fed at the state's expense, just like an athletic victor. In the end, a majority of the jury, consisting of about 500 Athenians, found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. So I will argue that the reason Socrates was condemned to death was the fact that he had instructed and associated with people who had been instrumental in the temporary undoing of the Athenian democratic state. Athens in the year 400 before Christ was in a state of upheaval and uncertainty. Today we would not condemn a person to death who criticized democracy because it seems so stable, and we do not think the teaching of individuals poses a threat to its continuation. But it was a completely different case when the trial took place, and Socrates had been implicated with men who had been instrumental in temporarily abolishing democracy in Athens. In the end, the theory he had passed on to young minds was carried out through them, with devastating consequences for the democratic Athens. These men had been killed during the war, but the teacher still remained. Socrates had ceased to be just a neutral bystander to events, a harmless philosopher, since he had thought and been personal friends with the greatest enemies of Athenian democracy. So, was Athens justified in killing Socrates? If a state is justified in killing a man that poses a threat to its very existence and continuation, and if we see Socrates as undermining democracy and still as a potential threat to the state, then yes, we can argue that Athens was justified in killing Socrates. At least it seems exile from Athens would be justified, which Socrates could most likely have chosen as his punishment.